So last time we talked about some of the major changes that happened in the early republic, particularly after that Jeffersonian Revolution, or when the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson and then James Madison and Monroe after that Virginia dynasty began to take power. There was a lot of innovations or things that happened that Jefferson didn't really foresee. And very quickly it becomes apparent that not just the contradiction of racial slavery and that agricultural ideal that's embodied in Jefferson, that's not the only tension or major contradiction. So as we go forward in the next few lessons, we're going to talk about some major changes that happen in American politics, with economy and technology, in religion, which we'll see. And we'll see that this rapid evolution in these things very quickly make it impossible for that Jeffersonian vision of an agricultural ideal to ever actually become a reality. I like to think of each one of these as almost like a Procreate or a Photoshop layer. If you're creating something, you can work on one layer and then another and then another, and then you can press them together to get a holistic vision of kind of the landscape. And so if we look at these changes in politics, we look at these changes in technology, economics, and we look at these changes in religion, we very quickly see how these unforeseen rapid evolution of society and culture and all of these various spheres of change make it where this Jeffersonian vision of an agricultural nation of independent farmers becomes increasingly impossible. The first thing we're going to look at is politics. Historians often talk about Jacksonian democracy. You'll see this term used as kind of a descriptor of the major political changes that happened really from the 1820s to the 1840s, roughly in that time frame, that first chunk in the first half of the 1800s. And these major changes that occur are largely attributed to Andrew Jackson, or the Jacksonian faction that will eventually become the Democratic Party. So to kind of understand this shift, maybe we need to know a little bit about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a plantation owner in Tennessee outside of Nashville. He's one of the last of the revolutionary generation. He's not from a very prominent lineage, so his family didn't go to Harvard like John Adams, John Quincy Adams. He's not even like Jefferson. We saw that Jefferson was kind of this window where he had this idea that an expanded electorate and more educated people could be brought into the Democratic project. He was put more of a focus on the common man than the Federalists did. And here with Jackson, we really see this kind of pushed to the limit. So, what Jefferson kind of portrayed himself sometimes as, Jackson really was. With that comes a lot of the things that the Federalists were afraid of. Jackson was short-tempered, he was proud, he was aggressive, combative. He literally had bullets in his chest where he was dueling and had lost a duel but lived through it. He's really not just the common man, but this rough, kind of aggressive frontiersman that a lot of elite American society didn't think really should be a part of the democratic process. But he uses this, and he begins to portray himself as a protector of the common man from wealth and power, from elite. Really this idea that the common man needs to go into the federal government, and they needs to purge it from this elite control that it's had for so long. It's not a coincidence that our President Donald Trump, when he was initially running, said that he revered Andrew Jackson as someone who was going to come in and purge the elite federal government of the control that it had over the common man. To understand the division that begins to happen here, we need to understand the evolution of the Democratic Republican Party. Remember, since the War of 1812, the Federalists had essentially fallen out of power. We talk about this as the era of good feelings, where there's actually, on paper at least, one political party, the Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Party. But very quickly, we see that a lot of those old Federalist ideas become very influential in that party. And as that begins to happen, that paradox that already existed in Thomas Jefferson, remember that focus on small government while simultaneously being willing to use the federal government, specifically we saw with the Louisiana Purchase when it benefited that expansion of power, those contradictions are going to continue to come to the surface. Very quickly, we see that a lot of those old Hamiltonian ideas that were rejected by the Democratic Republicans early on actually become very popular within certain Democratic Republican circles. And eventually, as that happens, we get to see that small government faction that was present within Jefferson and that Hamiltonian vision that is still present within his party, even after the Federalists die out, begin to split that. And very quickly, that era of good feeling starts to not feel very good. An example of this is Henry Clay. If you remember that Henry Clay was that Kentucky congressman that helped barter or broker the Compromise of 1820. Henry Clay is often referred to as the Great Compromiser because he becomes such a central figure in staving off these like harsh tensions that begin to happen in between the parties. And we'll see him be really pivotal in the Compromise of 1820. He helps broker a compromise later with Jackson, and then eventually he'll help lay the groundwork for the Compromise of 1850 as well. So that title of Great Compromiser is well earned. Henry Clay is going to begin to pioneer what he calls the American system. And if you look at what the American system is, it looks a lot like Hamilton's Federalist parties. They essentially want a tariff to promote American industry over imports. What that means is they put a tax on imports so that people will buy American products as opposed to foreign products. Instead, we will export and get paid for American products is the idea there. He wants a national bank. Remember, that was one of the central platforms of Hamilton's federalism. And he'll also want subsidies for internal improvements. And this is really important because what this is essentially saying is that Clay and the people that agree with Clay within the Democratic Republican Party are going to want to tax the American people and use that money to create roads, canals, large infrastructure projects that will make space, or in the words of John C. Calhoun, conquering space possible. You can see how this is going to give a primacy towards connectivity, a larger federal government eventually, a government that involves itself with changing the physical landscape in order to promote interconnectivity, business. Very quickly, this will lay the groundwork for regulation and a business-focused party. On the other hand, Jackson and his followers are going to want to scale back anything that looks like government bureaucracy. They're going to focus on uprooting corruption. They're going to cut government spending instead of adding to it. They're going to want to completely destroy the national banks. You could see how this disagreement could be portrayed in terms of federalism versus anti-federalism, or a neo-federalism versus a small government or small federalist version of the future. During the 20s, essentially America is battling over this version of large federal government versus small federal government again, with Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson at the center of this. In 1824, there is a presidential election. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, they're all throwing their hat into this. And essentially what happens is Jackson wins the popular vote, but he doesn't get that 51% that he needs. Clay endorses Adams at the end of it, essentially working together, and Jackson is going to see this as a corrupt bargain, how people are playing against him, and despite the fact that he got the popular vote, he was essentially in his mind robbed the presidency. So he's going to become very embittered about this. And as the 20s begin to go on, we're going to see these two visions of America begin to split. When we see them split, we will see that Jeffersonian party, the Democratic Republican Party in the era of good feelings, split, and we will have two parties that emerge. The Whig Party, which is essentially the Henry Clay American system, tariffs, bank, infrastructure party, and the Democratic Party, which is the Jacksonian party of cutting government spending, of destroying the national bank, of putting forth the common man, very much that holding on to that more agricultural vision, or that focus on state government as opposed to federal government, both of which held a very uneasy tension within the Jeffersonian legacy. So Jackson didn't win in 1824, but he comes back in 28 and he sweeps it. So when Jackson comes in, this is going to be seen as a win for the common man in a lot of American minds. So there's some major innovations that happened under Jackson that get attributed either rightfully or wrongfully to him. One of this is the extension of universal white male suffrage. Now, states were already kind of going in this way. As the Federalist elite kind of version of what American politics should be began to wane, states began to do away with property qualifications, or the idea that you should own property in order to be able to vote. So this is something that we can't 100% attribute to Jackson, but his presidency is seen as emblematic of this change. So the extension of universal white male suffrage, or the ability of all white men, whether they're poor or rich, to be able to vote, is seen as a Jacksonian innovation, even though he can't be solely responsible for that change. The second is the spoils system. This is the practice of putting people who are loyal to the president in positions of power when the president comes in. So depending on your perspective of whoever's in power, the spoils system can either be a tool for democracy or a weapon against it. Argument for the spoils system is that whoever comes in, right, whoever is the victor and gets the spoils of winning the presidential race, then you have voted for that person, and therefore you voted for their policies. So the idea here is that when they come in, they can put whoever they want in the places of power that they need to in order to get the things done that they said that they were going to get done when they were running for president. The flip side to this is that oftentimes people get put into positions of power not because they are the best suited for that job, but because they were loyal to the president. So you can see how for a lot of people, the spoils system actually opens the presidency up for rampant corruption. And so this is something that's really interesting. In a lot of people's minds, Jackson is going to be this emblem of coming in, of wiping out elite people, of putting common people in the places that they should be in democratizing the executive branch. In other people's minds, it's going to open the world for him to come in and put who he wants to be in certain places because of their loyalty to him. So depending on your perspective, the soil system can either expand democracy or it can become a tool for despotism or a dictator. Critics of Jackson portray him not as a defender of the common man, not as an extender of democratic ideals or access to democracy, but actually as a tyrant. And they point to a couple of things that are really significant. The central critique is his policy against Native Americans. Jackson actually rose to power because of his violence in the Seminole Wars. He was seen as a suppressor of Native Americans, and as awful as it is to us, many Americans actually thought that this made him a better American. Jackson saw Native Americans as destined for extinction. He would talk about them in very paternalistic and pejorative ways, racist ways. He would talk about himself as the great father of the red children, and he wanted to purge them from the eastern seaboard so that Americans could have, or white Americans could have that land. In 1830, he's going to help push forward the Indian Removal Act, and what this is essentially going to do is it's going to target the Choctaw, Chickasaw, the Creek, Seminoles, the Cherokee, these host of Native American tribes that live in the Southeast, and it's going to want to relocate them to what will become Oklahoma. This will lay the groundwork for the Trail of Tears that comes after that. There's this ongoing battle between Native Americans that we try legally to push back against this relocation that happened. And eventually there is the Treaty of New Anchota where they decide to accept what happens. In 1835, after he leaves office, the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Native Americans from these various tribes die as they begin to be pushed forward westward. So if we think about his legacy as a defender of common man or the expansion of democracy, we have to make sure that it's tempered. While he might be a representative of poor white people who are not able to vote before or who don't see themselves as represented in Congress or whatever it may be, he is also a violent suppressor and removal of Native Americans. In 1832, there's another presidential election. Henry Clay goes against Andrew Jackson again, and he is smoked this time. I mean, Jackson, he takes him 219 to 49 in the Electoral College. It's pretty brutal. But the Jacksonian coalition that really emerges out of this begins to have some trouble here in the late 1820s and 1830s. And we really see this emerge in the 1820s. So there is this tariff that is put on importation. You can see how this becomes very divisive by looking at the South. One of your readings is John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina senator. And so early on, John C. Calhoun was a national Republican. He was really bought into that Henry Clay version, the idea that the federal government should tax people, that they should spend that tax money on building roads and canals and infrastructure. That way we could, in John C. Calhoun's words in the reading, that we can conquer space. Right? That's very important. If people are separated and divided, they can't get together. It undermines national unity. It undermines trade. It undermines a lot of things. But as time goes on and these tariff policies begin to affect American citizens, we're going to have people like John C. Calhoun that will say, look, this is actually hurting our economy. We need to be able to free trade with England better because it makes things more affordable for us. He says these taxes on imports mean also less exports. There's this trade war that goes on, and this undermines the cost of living for many Americans. He's specifically talking about the South in terms of cotton distribution. And he'll actually come out and say, look, these policies undermine the peculiar institution of the South. And what he means by that is these policies undermine racial slavery in the South, or the slave power in the South. So we can see very quickly how this national Republican push here begins to really get Southerners up in arms. And what is really interesting here is John C. Calhoun will actually appeal to that Jeffersonian notion of nullification. Remember when Jefferson was pushing back against the Alien and Sedition Acts of the Federalists? He said, look, if there is an unjust or tyrannical law, something that is undermining the benefit or the autonomy of the states, then the states can nullify, or they can ignore that law. And this is really a crisis. I mean, this is called the nullification crisis for a reason. This begins to push the American political system to a point of chaos. And it almost leads to war. This is something where Calhoun was saying, look, if there needs to be violence here, the peculiar domestic institutions of the South, racial slavery is being undermined in the South. And if that's the case, we're going to ignore or nullify these tariff or these laws. If need be, Calhoun thought that he could go as far as seceding from the Union. And he was vice president at the time, almost a mirroring of what was happening with Thomas Jefferson under the Federalist Adams. He's taking nullification to its logical conclusion. Think about the difference of opinion about what the Constitution is at this point. The central disagreement is it the states that give the federal government power, or is it the federal government that gives the states legitimacy? What the nullification position says is it's the states that make up the federal government. And when the federal government oversteps, when it imposes something that is seen as tyrannical onto the states can reject that law. We saw with Jefferson, he was appealing to this for free speech, free press against the Federalist overstep in the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is rightfully seen as a valiant cause. Here we have the nullification argument being pushed as far as it can to succession over the defense of racial slavery in the South. We have the contradictions of the Jeffersonian legacy made clear by Jeffersonian political reasoning appealing to nullification. The nullification crisis almost splits the federal government. Here we have the Democratic president who is seen as the defender of the common man, who argues against pushing back against the expansion of the federal government, fighting with a vice president who is arguing for states' rights. Henry Clay jumps in to broker, to try to de-escalate things as the vice president and the president are going head to head. The president, Jackson, is saying, look, disunion is armed force. This is treason that you're threatening here. And he's essentially saying that I will use federal force against South Carolina if necessary. Meanwhile, John C. Calhoun is pointing to the Democratic president that's supposed to be, the representative of the common man, and he's going to say, you are a despot, you are a dictator. Henry Clay ends up getting the tariff lowered, but they also passed this force bill, which essentially says we could do it if we don't. Think about, again, that kind of going back to the Declaratory Act we saw in the American Revolution. So once again, Henry Clay helps us dodge a crisis that could potentially dissolve the Union. This isn't the end of Jackson's problems. He quickly turns his attention to the bank. Remember, one of his central critiques is that the national bank is a threat on American democracy. It empowers big money interests, that leads large bankers and this corporatization of America that's beginning to happen in the early 1830s and 1840s. He's essentially going to say that this needs to be thwarted because this is going to undermine the freedom of the common man. The Bank of the U.S. was the largest corporation in the country. And so what Jackson's going to do, because he hates the bank, is he's going to veto it. Every few years, the charter for the bank has to be revoted on. It has to be extended. And so he's going to veto the charter. He's not just going to veto the bank so that it's going to end at a certain point instead of continuing, but he's also going to start pulling federal money out of the Bank of the U.S. and begin depositing it into state banks in the South and the West. And so when he begins to do this, obviously this is going to lead towards fear. People are going to run and try to get their money out of the bank. So obviously this is going to lead to chaos. And this is what eventually leads the National Republicans, or that Henry Clay wing of the Jeffersonian Party, to officially form the Whig Party in differentiation. As we come into the 1830s, we are going to have the solidification of that new two-party system, the Whigs, which are essentially a neo-federalist American system, Henry Clay version of the Jeffersonian Party. And then you're going to have that small government anti-elite wing of the Jeffersonian Party solidify into the Democratic Party. So going forward, we'll have the Whigs, and the Democrats as that second American party system. After its charter was over, the U.S. bank shut down in 1841. Leading up to that, the dissolution of the bank created economic chaos. There's a panic in 1837. Panic of 1837 surrounding the future of the Bank of the U.S. Leads to economic chaos in America.